Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome into another YouTube live show. I am John Kurtz. Sorry for running late a little bit tonight. Had an event. As you can see, I'm very dapper. I'm dressed up very nicely. I mean, I love you guys, but I wouldn't typically dress up like this just for a live show, much as I do appreciate and love each and every one of you. But hopefully that makes the presentation tonight all the better. We've got a lot to talk about, don't we? Put in a little video on this on Monday, but about 24 hours after doing the show on Sunday, we got the news that this ACC settlement was coming down the pike. It's here. It's official. Everybody is trying to make sense of the aftermath of this, who won, who lost. And we will do winners and losers because I think you can make the case like it goes all the way around the board. Like I will just give you a little hint here. There are multiple parties that I have in both the winners and losers category of what happened with the ACC settlement. I think college football as a whole is a loser in the ACC settlement. I think there are teams in the Big Ten and the SEC that need to watch their backs now because of what happened here. And Pat Forty from Sports Illustrated dropped a nice little nugget about the Big 12 and Louisville and Pitt. Is that something that can happen as a result of this in the aftermath, something that has been long speculated? We will discuss that. There was also a great hypothetical about Oklahoma that I thought was fantastic. Okay. I'm not somebody who's ever really peddled in like, oh, does Oklahoma like regret going to the SEC? But we have a hypothetical that's been presented here. Like, hey, based on what happened in the ACC, is there a way that you could formulate some sort of package, not in reality, but in hypothetical land here, formulate some sort of a package based around that actually would make Sooner fans be like, that might be a better deal than what we have right now in the SEC. So I'll get to that. And if we have time, Mack Rhoades, Baylor athletic director, is going to be the new chair of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. He is the new Ward Manuel. So what does that mean for the Big 12 as it ventures out into this big, bad Power 2 world next year across college football? Appreciate you all for being here. Please like the video. Please do subscribe to the channel if you are not subscribed. Would very much appreciate that. You can also subscribe to the Open for Business Big 12 newsletter, ofbnews.com, or click the link in the description of the video. I've got one coming in your inbox tomorrow morning about all of this, plus a lot of Big 12 basketball coverage. It is totally free. It's straight to your inbox multiple times per week. 3,500 plus Big 12 fans reading. So would love it if you join them. That is a great way to support the content and the work that I'm doing right now if you are so inclined and into doing that. If you want to be a part of the show tonight, obviously fill up the regular chat box, but you can also submit a super chat by clicking the $ below the chat box to ensure that your question or comment makes it on the show tonight. Appreciate everybody who does do that as well. Couldn't do it without your support. But again, it's totally free just to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Shout out to my guy, Buffalo K-State. You are going to see yourself in a tweet of yours here on the show before too long. I'll just, I'll bust the secret here. It's the Pat Forty clip. So thank you for tweeting out the Pat Forty clip earlier this week. Also, John-Kurtz-4 on Venmo if you would like to support the channel. That way you can leave your question or comment there. So it's a great way if you're not able to catch the show live, leave me a question or comment there and I will kick off the next live show with it. So you can still be a part of all the conversation happening here. There was one other thing. Oh yes, merch. If you want some John Kurtz merch or some Open for Business merch, you can hit the link in the description of the video as well for that. So very easy. Easy way to do that. Let's get things rolling. The ACC settlement happened. We got some stories coming out in the last couple months that this was probably going to happen, and it did. So Florida State and Clemson settled their 4 different lawsuits in multiple states with the ACC. I think you can argue there are ways that both sides win. I would certainly argue that Florida State and Clemson won the settlement more than the ACC. But the ACC didn't totally lose either. The problem here is I think one of the biggest losers in all of it is college sports as a whole. But I digress. Here we are. Can't take the toothpaste out of the tube. We are already down this road in college athletics, and this was very much on par with what we've come to expect out of the sport lately. Lots of winners and losers to pass around here. And as I said, I think there are entities involved in this that fit in both the winners category and the losers category. Crazy as that may seem. Winners, number one, plural here. They are 1A and 1B. And there has been, people have made this point. I'm certainly not breaking any ground by making this point. But before I mention Florida State and Clemson here, guys, the biggest winner in everything that happened this week is North Carolina, Miami, and Virginia, I guess, if you want to include them. But it's the schools that have options or will have options that didn't have to spend a bunch of money taking this all to court. They just used Florida State and Clemson as a shield, and they didn't have to take any of the bad guy brunt from the conference, and they got to, probably more importantly, just save their wallets. They got to save their wallets in all of this, man. I can't imagine how much the legal fees add up to for Florida State and Clemson, particularly Florida State, who's been at this the longest. They certainly, the other part of it being the villain part, I was going to say, like, that becomes stressful, and you get a lot more just heat and memes online thrown at you, like Florida State, especially if you have a 2-win season, right, on the heels of this. You're going to take a lot of crap. You're going to take a lot of crap online, and that definitely happened. Florida State, though, seemed to kind of relish that. Like, Florida State fans, administration, all the way back to those early board meetings where they were just so demonstrative about, like, we're going to get out. They didn't seem to care about playing the villain role. Almost like had been looking down at a lot of the conference for a while and wanted a chance to really kind of flex the muscle publicly and was okay to get in this fight. Like, it kind of seemed like Florida State kind of seemed to me like guy at the bar who's just waiting for a fight, You're just looking over at him like, man, no one's really even doing anything to you, but you keep slamming those beers and getting really aggressive with everybody for no reason. It feels like you just want to get into a fight. So there was a bit of that for Florida State. Maybe they didn't mind as much. But to me, as a neutral observer, that would be an extra stressor that I wouldn't want to take on if I didn't have to. And North Carolina, Miami, Virginia, those schools just get to, like, hang back and let Florida State and Clemson do the dirty work for them. Now, they get all of the spoils that come with what I'm about to mention for Florida State and Clemson here, why obviously they are winners. And if you want to, if you have to declare an ultimate winner or a loser, which may not be totally fair to do here. This is a little bit more along the lines of, big trade, blockbuster trade in the NFL, NBA, whatever it might be. Like, both sides can win in some ways. And there is an element of that at work here. But I would say that the bigger winners are Florida State and Clemson because, they're not getting out of the ACC tomorrow, which would have been like best case scenario for them. Best case scenario is goes to the legal system fast, which we know was unrealistic, and grant of rights gets torn to shreds in the courts. They can leave whenever they want. That would have been best case scenario. They didn't get that. But what they do get is a chance to earn a bunch more money in the near term. And the details on that, I mean, you're looking to make up a $30 million plus gap between your SEC and Big Ten peers. They can make up to $25 million per year in success initiatives. If you go deep into the playoff, I mean, you can be pushing that $25 million number. And there's extra brand incentive money now that's there too, brand initiative money rather, that they can pick up as well. And that would be an extra chunk of change there. We know that Clemson has gone through its projections and feels like it could make $20 million extra per year over the next 6 years. I'd imagine that might even be a little bit conservative based on, what the success initiative could add up to if they get back to being the Clemson of old. But that gives you an idea here. You're looking to make up like $35 million gap. If you can get 20 million of that back, that's pretty good, man. That's pretty good. That's a nice deal. We know that the gap, what's been reported now, the gap between number 1 in revenue in the ACC and number 18, which would be dead last in revenue in the ACC, once all this goes down, is going to be about $20 million. So it's significant. You're going to be making a lot more money here. So that's great. Brand initiative is a huge win in a couple different ways, right? Beyond just the obvious here that they will make more money. They're generally on TV more, but they've kind of rigged the system. And this is where I start to get into, at the same time I say winners here, Florida State and Clemson, losers college football, because this is just such a greasy, it's not like anything here is like outright illegal, but it just is like greasy, good old boys, like, doing the things that are going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy here for the big brands, because you're going to get a lot more eyeballs on your games if you're playing Notre Dame. Well, what did we just hear about with the ACC? A new scheduling agreement where guess who's going to be playing Notre Dame? It's the bigger brands. The bigger brands get to play Notre Dame. At the same time, you're being rewarded for more people watching your games. So sorry, Wake Forest. You may not get as much opportunity to play Notre Dame. That's going to go to Florida State. Even if they win only 2 games, they will draw more eyeballs onto that game and make more money. And that's just how it's going to be set up in perpetuity. Well, or for the next 5 or 6 years while we have this whole thing set up. That's the kind of stuff that we're having happen all over the place in college sports right now. And I'm not saying that the sport wasn't always slanted toward big brands. It certainly always kind of was, but it just is coming out in a more like out in the open, less bashful way. Like nobody has any shame about just straight up doing it this way anymore. That I think is what has kind of changed with the sport here recently. They also, of course, get a drastically reduced exit fee, which is the bigger deal long term. It's the bigger deal if you are looking at what's going to matter in 5 years. Because I know some people will talk about, hey, and maybe maybe Florida State and Clemson are still eager enough. I won't say desperate, but eager enough to do this, that with the $165 million exit fee, which is what it will drop to in 2026. And when I say exit fee, like the whole package, grant of rights, all that, it would cost $165 million to get out. Maybe they would still be willing to try and go down that road. Maybe. I would have my doubts that it would come to that. So you're probably looking at 2030, but still $75 million. I mean, that's 10 times less almost than the $700 million that was quoted at one point by Florida State's legal staff. That's a massive difference. And really at one point they weren't even getting a number period from the ACC, who was like, no, we don't have to release your media rights. We're just not going to do it. That is much, much better. It's a lot of compromise on the ACC's part. Obviously, it coincides with 2030 when the Big 10 TV deal is up, the Big 12 TV deal is coming up. Everyone thinks there will be a lot of change there. So Florida State and Clemson, obvious winners there. Now, as I said, the ACC, I think, also a winner in this too, because they don't lose their conference. Like the conference isn't gone. College football. I just declared college football a loser. College football is also a winner because the grant of rights did not get torn up in court. We didn't get the opportunity for that to happen. Had this had gone down the entire road, played through to the finish, we could have had them declare the grant of rights not ironclad at all. And then no grant of rights. Then you're going to start looking around like, wait, so if someone wants to leave a different conference, like go from the Big 10 to the SEC or something, like, can we do that now? Because the grant of rights doesn't mean, you could have total chaos with other leagues if that were going to be the case. Hell, that'd be tough news for the Big 12. I don't know that anybody really has significant options, but teams would certainly be more willing to look around. So the ACC does win because they didn't lose their conference. The grant of rights was not declared inept. It will give them probably 5 years of stability. Not assuredly, but probably 5 to 6 years of stability here. And not only is that obviously a win, but you also can just use that time to figure out what the next move is going to be for everybody else. Even if you feel like, hey, this now becomes very inevitable that Florida State and Clemson are going to leave, well, you got time to plot your next move. So that time is very, very valuable. And even for these smaller schools, right, that, school number 18 next year that's going to make $20 million less than Florida State or Clemson, even that school, this is a better fate than being Oregon State or Washington State right now. Losing $7 to $8 million from what you expected to make beforehand with the TV contract, that is still so much better than being Washington State or Oregon State, floundering right now, always losing coaches, losing your quarterback in the portal, just a new reality of life for them. It's better than that. It is better than that. So there's, I think, a pretty good rundown of some winners and losers, but mostly the winners here. I had to jump into the losers category just a little bit. But let's talk about another really big piece of all of this, which is that there are some losers here that I don't think there is enough talk about. right now. There are some real losers here that I don't think there's enough talk about right now. Everyone wants to discuss what is happening with Florida State and Clemson, but what about the big picture precedent that this sets? Like, this is bigger than FSU and Clemson in the ACC. This actually starts to turn into something that we're going to see all across the board in college football. So this means that even teams in the Big Ten and the SEC, right, feeling untouchable, feeling invincible a lot of times these days, the same schools that will be chirping at you about SEC, and championing the accomplishments of Alabama, LSU, Georgia, those same schools are in some trouble now. So, man, because it is very obvious. Let's look at what's happening right now in the sport. Like, the Big Ten already has all these advantages. They have the richest TV contract in the sport, even slightly better than the SEC. Those guys are making so much money. And yet, what story just came out in January? It was that the Big Ten is accepting bids, looking into bids for private equity. Like, they're still looking around like, hey, that was a pretty good idea, Big 12. We may need a cash infusion here, even though we have all the money, all the advantages. Okay, so they're going to make cutthroat moves, you would have to imagine, when it comes to finances right now. Nobody is like in the mode of like, hey, maybe we should put this in the piggy bank and save things. Like, no, and we need more, and it's all greed driven. That's what's happening all across the sport right now. Okay, so with that in mind, how do you think the Big Ten, thinking it needs private equity, is looking at this right now? How do you think this is sitting in Columbus, Ohio? How do you think this is sitting in Ann Arbor, Michigan? They can look at the TV ratings. Like, you'll put Ohio State against Northern Illinois on Big Noon kickoff before you will put a couple of mid-tier Big Ten teams playing, you know, before you would put even like Iowa, Wisconsin on Big Noon kickoff. You would put Ohio State and Toledo, because you know how many eyeballs are going to be on the Buckeyes. They know how much more that they could make if you're going to start tilting all that revenue. Think of how big that revenue pot is too in the Big Ten, man. It's a lot of extra money that you could be making if you started doing it based on ratings. Tony Petitti's ears have got to be burning with leadership in some of the bigger brands, you know, out at Autzen Stadium, right? How's Oregon thinking about this too? The bigger brands. Didn't USC at one point try to push this through in the Pac-12 back in the Larry Scott era? They wanted some sort of unequal revenue sharing program here. I'm sure they're going to be back on top of that, even though their football program materially is not that great right now. I'm sure they are thinking the same thing. And then in the SEC, you know, I mean, they're not exactly known as just being folks who are out for, you know, utilitarianism. Like, let's just, you know, rising tide lifts all boats. Let's make sure everybody's good in the sport. No, very much greed driven, very much out for themselves. I'm sure Alabama and Georgia are looking around like, why are we paying Vandy the same amount that we are? The same way that Ohio State is looking like, why are we giving $70 million to Northwestern? Why not give them 35 or 40 and we'll divvy up the rest, right? This seems like a smart thing that you guys are doing, ACC. It's the way that this sport is moving, man. And it's crappy. And I don't like that this is where things are at, because it's this like hyper capitalism that is just taken over the sport. And it's going to wind up making it so much worse, and already has. But it is the reality. Greed is here. It's not going away. And if you think it's not permeating the Big Ten and the SEC right now with the wandering eye looking over at this plan, I think you are very, very, very naive. Very naive. And, you know, the conversation has been had a lot before. Like, well, people asked, you know, especially in the real heat, when we were in the throes of all of this realignment stuff, you know, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when it was really popping and hot, when we had back-to-back summers of SEC stealing teams, Big Ten stealing teams, and then the Big 12, Pac-12 thing. Everyone was asking, like, all right, well, how long are the SEC and Big Ten going to just keep these other schools around? Will they just cut them out? You know, would they completely cut them out of the conference to trim the fat and up their money that way? And well, they are very greedy, and it is hyper capitalistic, as I mentioned. That did seem to be like probably a bridge too far, at least at this point, for some of those schools. That can get messy. Like some of these schools have been with you from the jump, man. They're ride or dies. They've been with you for a long time. So the idea of cutting them completely out now seems crazy. Now, the Pac-12, push came to shove. They got painted into a corner, and you saw where the loyalty was when it came to Oregon State and Washington State. But we're not quite, we're obviously not at that like sort of desperate state for these leagues. So they don't want to deal with the mess of that. Well, this is like a perfect way to basically do that, but not deal with the mess of it. It's kind of their own version of a Florida State Clemson-esque compromise. They wouldn't get all $70 million of Northwestern's share back, but you could get half of it. Maybe you get half of it. Pay them 35, you divvy up the rest to those of us that are driving the eyeballs, right? And you can avoid dealing with the mess, still get richer and take that money. And when I talk about losers here, I just said Florida State and Clemson are winners, right? Florida State and Clemson, there are obvious ways that they are winners in this settlement. But if this idea is just going to be stolen by the Big Ten and the SEC, then really Florida State loses the ground that they just made up on some of these top tier teams in the Big Ten and the SEC. They're getting, as we just discussed, some of the math on that. If you're going to get an extra $20 million a year, you can more than have the difference between you and the SEC. But then if Ohio State is just going to steal, $20 million more from Northwestern and Indiana because of success and brand initiatives, well, then you're not actually gaining any ground on them. Now, I think what really matters to Florida State and Clemson is, can we gain ground on South Carolina and Florida? And maybe that still happens based on the current state of those programs. Although, last year, South Carolina, succession initiative wise, they might have done okay. But it gets very complicated. They do also, they want to truly compete at the top of the sport. And it comes back to the same issue with the Big 12 and private equity. When it's like, that seems like almost a necessary evil for the Big 12 at this point, but there's nothing stopping the Big 10 and the SEC from just doing the same thing and taking the exact same plan that the Big 12 had laid out there. And it looks like the Big 10 is already in progress in doing that. You take the exact same plan and you flip it to your own benefit. And now there's really nothing that's been gained. And the sport has become worse for it. So again, I go back to overall big picture, like we kind of all just lose. Anyway, that's some of the crappy part of where we're at in the sport. That is, I think, a harsh reality about what is happening here. And it's something that everybody needs to watch out for. Like the overall message here is just like nobody can really be safe unless you are in Columbus, Ohio, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Athens, Georgia. Like you get the idea. If you're one of the top 10 to 15 brands in the sport, you're probably good. If you are anybody else, you need to keep your head on a swivel. You need to keep your head on a swivel. You may still have the SEC patch and the SEC logo, which is definitely better than not. It's better than not being in there. But in terms of your finances and how much everybody has now at this point really internalized and loves being able to turn around and gloat over the fact like, little Big 12, a cute little Big 12 over there. I see it a lot with Missouri, Nebraska fans, that sort of attitude, like, oh, look at you guys over there. Well, wait a couple of years. You guys may have success and brand initiatives in place in the SEC. You're going to start getting squeezed on your pocketbook, and all of a sudden there won't be this massive competitive financial advantage that you have over schools in the Big 12 because of where this all appears to be headed. And none of this is good, man. None of this is good. It's not good for anybody. So anyway, all right. Keep the chat coming. Appreciate you guys that are here. Lively chat. You can click the $ below the chat box in order to submit a super chat and get your question or comment on for sure to ensure that if you would like to do so. Appreciate you guys' support that way. Don't have to. I do ask if you'd like the video and subscribe to the channel. That would be great. It would help me out a lot. Totally free way. to do that. John-Kurtz-4 on Venmo. If you want to drop a line there, I will kick off the next show with your question or comment. So even if you're not catching this live, I know I'm obviously on a different night this week because of my schedule. So if you're not able to make it live, totally understand. John-Kurtz-4 to get in touch with me there. And subscribe to the Open for Business Big 12 newsletter, ofbnews.com. You can find the link in the description of the video, as well as a link to some merch if you would like some merch. All right. Talk is focused here in the ACC on Florida State, Clemson, how they feel. I mentioned, hey, you should probably start to discuss a little bit the North Carolina angle. North Carolina, Miami being shielded by Florida State, Clemson. But what about once you even get below like that tier in the ACC, mid-tier ACC teams? What are they feeling right now about all of this? I think this is one of the places that we turn that starts to involve the Big 12. And it's not just me. This is not, and a lot of people I'm sure will probably roll their eyes a little bit at the subject matter of this and the topic of this. But it's not me that's bringing it up. I probably would not have done a bigger deep dive into this had it not been for me hearing Pat Forty from Sports Illustrated on the College Football Inquirer podcast with Dan Wetzel and Ross Dellinger. Dan Wetzel, congratulations, by the way, on getting hired back at ESPN. So, I mean, some of the biggest news breakers and most important personalities in the sport, these guys are all sitting around at a round table talking about this, and this is what Pat Forty brings up. He brings up Louisville and Pitt to the Big 12. Okay. Louisville and Pitt to the Big 12. So let me share my screen with you. And we will hear from Pat. There we go. Make sure that I got it squared up. Okay. Here's what Pat Forty has to say about Louisville and Pitt and the Big 12.
Beyond that, though, yeah, bad signals and further inequity. And I think, honestly, you're going to have schools, I would imagine, that are, on the shorter end of this stick. They're going to be looking at their options and saying, you know what? I'm Louisville. I'm Pittsburgh. How's Big 12 doing? Do we need to possibly look at going someplace else where we're going to get a better revenue shake? I wouldn't say it's out of the question for schools that aren't just, steeped in loyalty to the ACC and maybe feel like they have been handed a bad deal here. So I don't say they're going to get up and leave now, but you watch in 5 years and see what the possible exit plan.
So that is an important distinction. Why am I not back here? That is an important distinction that Pat Forty makes at the end there, which is like, hey, it's not like this is happening tomorrow. I don't think anybody, Florida State fans might disagree with me. We'll see. I don't think anybody really has the appetite for $165 million like tomorrow to get out. I certainly don't think that the appetite would be there for that with a Louisville or a Pitt. I mean, he kind of mentions like, maybe they'd be getting disenchanted with the idea of like, man, we're going to have to make whatever it might be, $10 million less a year than Florida State and Clemson. Like that doesn't seem really fair if you're Louisville. Like, man, we had a pretty good football season. We've had a solid football program here recently. We don't need to take that. Could we actually be making more money in the Big 12? But it's not going to be enough to make up, the $165 million upfront cost on that, right? But you start planting the seeds for 5 years down the road when this comes up. Because the dynamics have changed in the ACC with the addition of Stanford, Cal, and SMU to the point where they've got the strength in numbers that could theoretically keep them together as a conference if and when, probably more likely when, Florida State, Clemson, and North Carolina at least decide to leave. But like there would be a scenario there. There would be a scenario there where you could say, all right, only 3 schools are going to leave. Maybe just the 3. Only North Carolina, Florida State, and Clemson are coveted enough to actually get a spot where they would make a decent amount in the Big 10 or SEC. I say a decent amount because I'm still not completely convinced that would be a full share, but it would be enough that, maybe they get the invite and take it. You could keep the rest of the conference together. There would be the numbers for that. But if by that time you've got places like Louisville, places like Pitt being like, man, we don't have the historical connections here that you guys do, so we don't really care so much about the history of this. And history is just being flushed down the drain actively every single day in this sport anyway. Plus, like, I don't know, the Big 12 seems like it's dynamic, up and coming. Probably will have some sort of private capital infusion deal by that point. Looking around like maybe this is the way we need to do it. Like, this is our chance. This is when everything is changing. Let's make the jump. Let's make the jump and go do it, man. Why not? This could be something that pushes that further down the road. Whereas before, I think when we were really talking about the Louisville Pitts of the world for a while in the Big 12, it was much more in this scenario of like, well, Florida State and Clemson they're pushing their way out one way or the other. And that's going to happen. Everything will tumble from that. That'll create a big, crazy eruption. Either grant of rights will be deemed basically nonsensical, nothing that's going to hold that together. And it'll just be a free for all and everybody's going to leave. Or, before they had the extra 3 teams, Calford and SMU in there, like, oh, well, they won't have the numbers and then it'll just totally dissolve anyway. That was the thought of how the Big 12 would wind up with some of the other ACC schools at that point. It has been a little bit more solidified. I mean, credit to the ACC. They have become a little bit more solidified in what they've done now. So there is a little bit more of a question, I think, as to what you would do if you are a Louisville or a Pitt in that sort of scenario. And Pat Forty has kind of pointed out there might be some seeds of dissent that have been planted, with all of this and how this is going to work, and how it evolves over the next 5 years too. Like, this is better, as I mentioned. It is better for these schools than being Oregon State and Washington State, but it does not mean that there's not going to be some unhappiness. It does not mean that there is not going to be some hurt feelings here from a lot of people and just getting annoyed. Like, ask the Big 12 that. Like, you don't need to tell anybody around here, the show originating from Big 12 country, about what that's like and how many hurt feelings there were about the Longhorn Network and Texas being able to make that extra money, Oklahoma making a little bit of extra money too with the 3rd tier TV rights. Like, we know how that goes. And Florida State has already acted very brash about all this. I'm sure they have not made a lot of friends in the conference over the last 2 years throughout this whole saga. So yeah, we shall see. Once again, wouldn't expect anything in the immediacy. I'm not trying to push anything like that. Like, there was that talk even for a little while. Hey, with private equity, could you lure Florida State or Clemson in almost immediately and use the private equity cash infusion to cover the exit fees and all that and make it happen and do that? You're not going to do that for, anybody other than Florida State and Clemson. And even then that might have still been a foolish idea. So that's not going to happen before a 5-year period, or maybe it's just if Florida State and Clemson do something crazy like that and everything there's some chaos scenario. But otherwise, you're looking at like 2030. But this did probably, I think start to plant some seeds for that. And it's not like Louisville and the Big 12. That's not going to be a totally new relationship. I mean, I know Brett Yormark was not around in 2011, but it's at least something that's been in Louisville's mind before, right? They've had this idea before when it was kind of Louisville and West Virginia duking it out for the last spot in the Big 12 after TCU had been added. After the last exodus of teams, or I guess the first exodus of teams from the Big 12 back around 2010, 2011. So that's already been close to happening. I was trying to look for the tweet today. Somebody out there has the tweet of like Louisville had some Big 12 signage made up at one point in time. Like that's how close it actually got. So this has been a flirtation before. Pitt would give you a natural rival with West Virginia. Obviously would love to have the backyard brawl in there. I'm sure Brett Yormark looks at Louisville basketball very favorably with what he wants to do for hoops. And 2030 again would be the time when you'd be trying to decouple the basketball rights to sell them separately. There are a lot of things that would make sense here. Obviously, the other part is, it has to sync up with a TV deal if you think they're going to be at worst a net neutral ad in terms of how much money each team in the league would get if you have them in your conference. But just keep this in the back of your mind, I guess, is really the idea here. Keep it in the back of your mind based on what we've seen here. And it's not some crazy Big 12 hypothetical scenario, because we're getting this from Pat 40, man. And I know there's a lot of you out there, oh, you know, he sucks, whatever. Kansas fans, I don't think are too fond of him because he's a Mizzou grad, but he's a respected guy that's been doing it for a long time, man. And I really like that podcast. So you got to listen to it. You know, if you're a Josh Pate hater or a College Football Inquirer hater, you're going to have to hear me sing their praises from time to time. I'm sorry about that. But retired stockbroker doesn't seem to mind that. So thank you. I assume that's for retired. I don't know, but I assume the RET there. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stockbroker. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your kind words. MJB Set 93. What's up, MJB Set 93? What are the odds big football completely disassociates with other sports conference media distribution model? Yeah, I mean, that's something that could be on the table, has been talked about for a long time. Like, you know, has college football just gotten so big that it has to, we use that word, decouple, right? Like decouple itself from the rest of everything that's going on in collegiate athletics. I mean, if you could do that, it would be the best thing ever for the Olympic sports to not have to deal with some of the stupid travel that's happening right now. And you would have just conferences for football and then more regional conferences that made sense for everything else. I will admit to being out a little over my skis on like logistics of how that would work and how realistic would it be that could happen. But I guess I don't know if you went to super leagues or a super league in 2030, whatever it might be, is the idea that would just be college football and then the rest of your Olympic sports just, or even men's basketball, whatever, like reorganize underneath that. Not totally sure, but I suppose that's a possibility that could be out there. So I apologize, I don't have like a better answer for you there, MJB Set 93, but I hope that gets somewhat to the heart of that issue. I'm going to make one point here because this blew up. So AZ Wildcat fan. And by the way, if you guys want to guarantee that you make it on, you can do so with a super chat. Click the $ below the chat box. But you can also throw out a take that I just really disagree with very strongly. And, you can make it on with that. So we're going to do that. Now, I'm going to be measured in this. I'm not coming to just destroy you here. I want to say that Josh Furlong, who's been on this channel before, and I really like, very nice guy who covers Utah for KSL, I believe it is. Does a great job. Love following his stuff. Would highly recommend following him on Twitter. I think he was coming in to cover the women's basketball tournament, and I know I saw him saying today that he was like, he had a flight issue and he was kind of annoyed, and he had just thrown out a tweet like, man, Vegas is right there. Like, why do we have to do Kansas City for the basketball tournament? And we had in Kansas City, it's been like 60. And then one day randomly earlier this week, we got like blizzard-like wind conditions and a little bit of snow, and that affected the travel. And it sucks. I hate it. But so he tweeted out in frustration, like, oh man, Vegas. And we know that that's been the push from like Utah, Arizona fans. They would rather see Vegas. I get it. If you've never experienced the Big 12 tournament in Kansas City, I understand how this is your thought. Like, why are we beholden to Kansas City? Vegas is a great spot for entertainment. Although I did literally just read an article about how Vegas has really fallen off. I'm not a Vegas guy at all. So I don't know this, but people talking about how it's gotten too expensive and it's really fallen off. It was actually, it was really insightful, interesting. But I get it. Vegas has a lot more entertainment options, particularly if you have a lot of expendable income. Vegas can be really fun. But the atmosphere at the tournament, like the games you're not going to have that many people there. You're competing with a lot in the city. Meanwhile, Iowa State fans, you get a ton of those there. You get a ton of K-State fans. Like, just the regionality of it around here makes it great. Power and Light, the entertainment district right outside of Sprint Center, is just totally filled with people all over the place. It's a really cool event that's embraced very much so by the city that treats it like a massive deal. And I would just say, you're entitled to your own opinion, but please come experience it in Kansas City before you go completely all in on pushing Vegas instead of Kansas City. Vegas is, if you want a very sterile option where the attraction is everything but basketball, then that's going to be your case there. But if you want an awesome atmosphere that is befitting of college athletics and what college sports is, then that's why you would want Kansas City and T-Mobile Center for the Big 12 tournament. The city does it right. They do it very well. And look, I will just say this too. Brady Ormark's a guy that likes moving stuff around. He moved football media days to Vegas, for instance. I mean, he had to sign off on the contract to keep it in Kansas City. Like, he obviously sees the value in it. He's now experienced it multiple times. And look, you don't always get what you want. The media seats got moved from right on the floor, which was awesome. I mean, I missed the heydays of Bob Bowlesby's Big 12 of just hanging out there in the media seats right up on the floor for the entire tournament. Now it's like way up in the top where you can barely see her, whatever. It sucks. But it is what it is. We can't all get what we want. Anyway, just wanted to chime in on that a little bit. All right, Mr. Wayner. What's up, Mr. Wayner? IMO ACC 2031 to 2036 exit fee of $75 million meant to keep mid-tier schools from jumping to the Big 12, leading and gutting the conference. How many would pay exit fee? It's an interesting point. I think they had to have something there, right? Because it's not like the leverage on the other side was that, hey, this thing just means nothing, because if you really wanted to argue the grant of rights would be nothing and means nothing, you'd have to go through a long court cycle that would then be filled with a lot of, you'd get a ruling and then you would just get a challenge. Why am I spacing on the word? They would challenge that, right? Appeal. God, you would appeal. There would be appeals and it would take forever. And so they weren't going to give in and just make it zero. But I do understand what you're saying, that that could be enough money to be a hindrance for some of the mid-tier ACC schools. Understood. And I think that's kind of what Pat Forty, why he starts to mention, maybe it would be better if we do feel like we're going to make an extra 10, 15 million dollars. We'll see what it'll be for the Big 12 by that point, because the Big 12, remember, will be getting a new deal. So if we play the game of TV deals continue to go up in value throughout the course of time, then the Big 12 will be at an advantage over the ACC then, because their deal will be coming up and the ACC will be stuck in what this current deal is. So the Big 12, and the valuation, remember from the private equity article, was they thought it would be over double what this current deal is. So if Big 12 schools are then making that much more money than what's in the ACC, then it would become something where they could make up that exit fee pretty quickly if they were to decide to go. And, well, John, what if they don't have $75 million sitting around? Well, by that point, we definitely assume private equity is going to already be in the game and in the sport. So take out a loan. Do that. Big 12 could probably help facilitate it. I think that's how I would kind of view it. But I think it's a valid point that you make. That definitely makes it tougher for schools like that to do it, as opposed to the highly, highly motivated, bigger business places like a Florida State or a Clemson. But that's a really interesting thought, an interesting point. I'm glad that you brought that up. What was my last? Oh boy, I'm excited for this topic. I like this topic, man. This takes me back to my my radio show days. 10 years of hosting a radio show, and this is a very, very made for sports radio topic. Okay. So stick with me here. This is all about a hypothetical. I do not expect this to really happen, but okay. So it was a rough first year for Oklahoma and the SEC, right? Their basketball team did get a nice win this week. Congratulations to Porter Moser and the Sooners, but they're 5-12 in the SEC in hoops, trying to hang on to the NCAA tournament. And then in football, obviously 6-7. And while it wasn't rough for their bank account this year, they made a lot more money. It was a tough one on the fan base, man. I see enough of Sooner Twitter to understand how difficult that is for the fan base right now to make that kind of impression in the SEC, especially when Texas did very well and advanced to the semifinals of the college football playoff. And I know it sounds totally crazy here, okay? But I just mentioned Dan Wetzel and the boys on the College Football Inquirer podcast. ESPN's Dan Wetzel laid out a great hypothetical, a great hypothetical scenario that might get Oklahoma fans clamoring to come back to the Big 12. Okay. Now, I'm not dumb and naive enough to think anybody is making any reversal moves coming back to the Big 12. This is not that. Okay. Don't just click off because of that. I'm asking you to hang with me and listen to this hypothetical scenario. Okay. It's all surrounded by the idea that, hey, we've seen now the ACC has offered the chance for big brands and successful teams to make extra money and take revenue away from teams who are not successful and are not big brands in their conference. Okay. So keep that in mind as I bring this clip up from Dan Wetzel. So here we go.
I know the SEC's got money. We all know where this is headed, but this is a nice little spot where you could be in this playoff anytime you're even reasonably good. You go to the SEC and you're going to find out how hard it is. And as I always thought, if the Big 12 had been able to sell that to Oklahoma, you know, that's what Oklahoma gave up. They made a lot of playoffs. I don't think they're going to make as many playoffs anymore. We'll see. Nothing against Oklahoma, but it's just a lot harder to beat all these guys than it was to beat the old guys.
Okay. Dan Wetzel's theory there, and he was talking about like, hey, you know, Florida State and Clemson, isn't this actually a really nice scenario that you've got set up in the ACC? Now you've kind of halved the financial gap, and you can just go to the playoff every year because you're about to have 2 automatic bids to the playoff. So as long as you are relatively good, you should be in the playoff every year. You'll be still making a decent chunk of money, and you're not going to go get beat up in the SEC like Oklahoma. So, okay, hear me out here. If you could make this case, and I know that you can't, I say toothpaste out of the tube all the time. It is way out of the tube on this. But if you could put truth serum in an Oklahoma fan and say, hey, what about this scenario? Okay. What about this scenario? Listen, you guys just experienced what life in the SEC was like, and it was 6-6. That's what life in the SEC was like. It was 6-6 life. Not fun, not what you're accustomed to, not what you want. SEC basketball now looks like the best basketball league in the country. You just experienced what that was like. Not that you care nearly as much about that as football, but you know, you're 5-12 in the SEC in basketball. How about look, Big 12 football? Because of what your league is doing to demand these automatic bids, the Big 12 is going to have 2 bids every year to that playoff, man. 2 bids every single year. Okay. Let's go through the history of Oklahoma in the Big 12. They won the Big 12 14 times, and all of those came post-2000. So they were winning more than every other year. Almost like 2/3 of the years they're winning the league. And then, of course, there are other leagues where they're losing the Big 12 championship game, potentially finishing in what would have been a number 2 spot. You're talking about almost every single year being in the playoff based on what the history was in the Big 12. Getting you in the playoff, by the way, will earn you, if we're going by the way the ACC is laying this out, $4 million per round until you get to the semis, and you're getting $6 million and beyond. So you're talking about stacking extra playoff money, success initiative money. If the Big 12 were to follow this plan and do it, which right now they have no incentive to do because there's no brand that's going to want to push for that. Nobody in the Big 12 is a dominant or successful enough brand or program in football right now to do this. But if Oklahoma came back and you could say, all right, well, we'll take the ACC blueprint. You guys can earn up to 20 or 25 million extra per year because of the success initiative. You will take a hit from what you made this year in the SEC, but it will be maybe like a $10 million per year hit, $15 million per year hit, but you can go to the playoff every year. Okay. And you will still be pretty close financially. If you gave truth serum to Oklahoma fans, how many would really be thumbing their nose at that? I understand that the idea here is all about prestige and the future of the sport, but I wouldn't really be concerned about the future if I were Oklahoma here either, because you're going to be fine. Like whatever the sport evolves into, Super League time, when that comes around, you will be fine. There is nothing to worry about there. It would be just a nice landing spot here for the next 5 or 6 years where you can continue. I mean, brand build, get in the playoff every year, make a substantial amount of money, more than the rest of your peers. They'll be exalted above the rest of your peers in the Big 12 and not have to get your ass kicked in the SEC. That's really it. Now, if you wanted to counter and say, John, one of those years Brent Venables was in the Big 12, he went 500 too. Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Yeah, maybe you just, a lot of it is you just don't have the guy. But you're seeing how poorly things can go if you don't have the guy really fast in the SEC. You've got a little more leeway on that in the Big 12. So, to me, that's a pretty compelling and interesting case there. Now, would you even want that if you're the Big 12? That's a whole different discussion because Big 12 people are very, very sour on Texas and how that went with the unequal revenue sharing in essence there with what they did with the Longhorn Network and just a person in the boardroom who has more authority and power than everybody else. It's not a vibe that anybody liked and had to deal with for so long. I mean, it started from day one in the Big 12 with Texas making Nebraska mad. I was just reading some more about that the other day with the Prop 48 guys and all that happened with Nebraska early on. So Big 12 fans may not want to deal with that anyway if you were putting true serum into Big 12 fans. But I really do wonder about that for OU fans, and that is really it's fascinating to me for the other reason, just because the Big 12 is the one league right now. When I said, hey, people are going to copy the ACC's way of doing this, their success initiatives, their brand initiatives, you will see that in other conferences. The Big 12 is the one where I don't know that you would really see that, right? Because who's going to be demanding it? Who's got the dominant team and brand they think right now? Colorado dominated the TV ratings last year. But do they is Coach Prime here for the next 5 or 6 years? I mean, that's what's driving the ratings. It's one guy. And I'm not trying to say that I think he's a flight risk tomorrow or something necessarily, but he flirted with the Cowboys publicly this offseason. So it's pretty contingent on that. I think Utah thought they were at that level of a program and then they went 5-7. Kansas has the huge basketball brand, but basketball is just a moderate to small chunk of this. It's obviously driven by football. Tech's got all the money, but hasn't turned it into winning yet. I mean, BYU, I guess, might have the potential, but I don't think BYU is going to be someone that would really push it anyway. So you don't have much of a reason to if you're the Big 12 now. But if you could tangle it in front of an Oklahoma, and again, this is a hypothetical. I know it. This is nothing realistic at all, but an interesting discussion. Wouldn't that be a better existence? Wouldn't that be a better existence if you are a fan? If you're an Oklahoma fan, I would think that would be a better existence. You would have more fun as a fan doing that than you would having to live the life of going 6-7 in the SEC. Just my 2 cents there. But I understand the SEC is fun and it's exciting, but it's only fun and exciting to go play at Georgia until you're having to play at Georgia and realizing the reality of that very, very quickly. So I don't know. Hey, Oklahoma fans, if you're here, Oklahoma fans come across this, let me know. Let me know in the comments. What do you think? And it's kind of along the lines of people saying the same thing with Nebraska fans. Did polls out. I did was it the Omaha World Herald? Did they do a poll one time of hey, would Nebraska fans want to be back in the Big 12? I feel like one of those polls came back maybe 60-40 yes. So yeah, anyway, I think after a while of getting beat up in your new league, it could be hey, maybe the grass wasn't so green here, even though we're getting a lot more green in our pockets. See what I did there? Almighty Finn, real quick, could you explain the beef between Texas and Nebraska? Well, that really was a big part of it. Nebraska at the time Texas came into the league, 1996 was the first year of the Big 12. I think that all started in 94, but 96 is when they come in. Well, 96, Nebraska had won the 94 and 95 national championships. So they were back-to-back national title winners. So they're, the big dude in the boardroom. And Texas came in with a lot of demands. One of them being, one of the big issues was these Prop 48 players. So at that time, you could have partial qualifiers or even non-qualifiers, guys who didn't academically qualify could come in to play for your program. They would have to sit out the first year, but they could be in your program and you could develop them. And Nebraska used that a lot. I read that I think on their 95 national championship team, they had 4 starters and like 6 major contributors that started that way. So Nebraska was using that a lot. And that was one thing Texas said, no, like this new conference, we're not going to have that. Like Big 12, not going to have that. They, were basically like thumbing their nose at that idea. So that was something that made them angry. I know that Texas and Nebraska butted heads a lot because Texas immediately walks in and thinks they're going to be the biggest, baddest dude in the room. Like I'm sure they felt like they were in the Southwest Conference, and Nebraska was literally doing that on the field at that point in time, and that caused a lot of tension. But I do know one of the specific issues there was that made Tom Osborne pretty upset. I don't think they totally got rid of it, but they changed the rule to where then you could only have 2 Prop 48 qualifiers like in your entire athletics department and 1 max per sport. So it like drastically cut down on what Nebraska could do with that. I know that was a part of the issue. So that's the best explanation that I can give you there, Almighty Finn. There was also, right up until the very end, right? You had the Indomitian Sioux Big 12 championship game where, did the ball land with time actually left on the clock for Texas to kick the field goal? You had that whole thing right down to the bitter end, man. Right down to the bitter end. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up with that. Maybe I'll hang on to the Mack Rhodes story. Baylor athletic director Mack Rhodes going to be the new playoff committee chair. We had a lot to chew on tonight. I appreciate you guys being here. Very active tonight. Great to hear from you all. Thank you for being here. Please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed. Would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the Open for Business Big 12 newsletter, ofbnews.com to do that, or you can click the link in the description of the video. That would be awesome. Yeah, I think, plan on talking to you on Sunday. Spread the word about the channel and take care, guys. I will talk to you all very soon.